Muslim populations. But Spain is an exception, right? Spain is a different story. And what can we learn from the unique experience of this story? So hopefully, inshallah, we'll have the slides up soon. But what I want to begin with, actually, as we discuss this topic, is a local story with you guys. So who here sort of feels confident about the history of Muslims in New York? I just want to see a show of hands, right? As I assume, not very many people. And this is a challenge for all of us. I'm from Toronto. We have the same challenge there everywhere, where when we think about Islamic history, we think about, the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We think about the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidin. We think about Salahuddin Ayyubi, right? We think about the Abbasids or something like that. We think about the Ottomans, and that's it, right? What we don't think about is the history that we ourselves have in the land in which we are present, the extremely rich history, right? So I want to introduce a person to you, and we'll see more about him on the slides as they come up, inshallah, whose name is Anthony Janszoon van Sali. Has anyone here heard this name before? Right? This person was born in Spain in the year 1607. 2 years before the expulsion of the Moriscos. And I'm using all of these terms. I'm going to say a lot of things that don't have a lot of background. We're going to explain them as we move through the presentation, inshallah. So things will become clearer. I just want to make the immediate connection. So if you don't know what a Morisco is right now, you don't necessarily have to worry about it. We'll go into more detail, right? So he's born in Cartagena, Spain in 1607, and he is one of the Moriscos, basically meaning a Muslim. Oh, there we go. Do we have slides now? Is there a way I can? Oops. Okay. I guess that's how it's going to work. Does this work? Can we go to the? Okay, we're on this slide. Perfect. Jazakallah khair. So now you guys can see the slides as well. And what we're seeing here on the right side of the screen, as you can see, if you can go back, yeah, this is the perfect slide, Jazakallah khair. You have a Muslim pirate. So first thing to note, just to get it out of the way, if you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, if you watch any of these movies or heard anything about pirate culture, a lot of that comes from actual Muslim culture, right? And this whole kind of legacy of piracy. Not that Muslims just like to go around and loot and steal. That's what's become sort of the norm in popular culture. We think about pirates that way, right? But as the Muslims lost control of Spain and the Christians conquered Spain, the Christian powers, they conquered Spain, one of the things that had to happen was this ongoing warfare in the Mediterranean and taking out the refugees from Spain, both Muslims and Jewish refugees. So you may have heard of at some point that a lot of Jews who were expelled from Spain by the Christians were resettled in the Ottoman Empire, for example, right? This is sort of a famous fact of history. Are we doing okay?
Can you pull your mic a little higher because sisters are not able to hear you?
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you can speak a little louder, if you can, please.
All right. Is that going to be better?
Yeah.
It's better? Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Sorry? A little higher? Well, it's not much room left. Go higher. How about now? Yeah, you guys are going to hear me breathe too. Awesome. Better? All right, Jazakallah khair. Really appreciate it. And so this person is a Dutch person who becomes a pirate. So that's on one side of the picture. I'll go into more detail in a second. What does any of this have to do with Spain, right? So his name is Janszoon van Sali. He's Dutch. Very similar to English. Janszoon means son of Jan, right? Van Sali means he's from this place called Sali, which I'm not sure if anyone's familiar, is a place in Morocco. So you're already seeing some of these interesting connections. But let's skip fast forward. Look on the left side, right? Or actually look on the right side for you. And what you see is a document which was a document granting land to his son to settle a place known in the Dutch language as Konijn Eiland. Does that sound like anything around here? You guys, everyone is making the connection here? Coney Island, exactly, right? I went there. It was a big waste of time, but I got to see the Atlantic Ocean. It was nice in that sense, I guess, right? But it was nice to go to the place where the first known Muslim in New York City, who we know about, actually first settled. So we'll go into the details of the story in a second. So if we can move down the slides a little bit, just go to the next slide after the pictures. Inshallah. All right. And so the interesting story with this particular individual is, right, his father is Dutch. So now we're talking about the son of Jans Zoon, whose name was Anthony, or he's remembered as Anthony. His father is Dutch. His mother is Moorish, so she is a Arab from Spain, basically, right? Her name was Margarita. He is brought, first he's enslaved by the Muslim pirates, complicated story, right? He's brought to Algeria, right? This Dutch person. And then he embraces Islam. He's eventually freed. He goes to Spain because that's where most of the traffic is. These people are sailors. They're constantly moving goods and people back and forth. And again, there's a huge refugee crisis. Everyone is trying to get out of Spain because there's only so much choice you have in Spain, right? You can either be forced to convert to Christianity, or you can choose to basically die, right? Or you can choose to leave. Those are your three options. And of course, many people want to retain their Islam and they are trying to leave. And these pirates are facilitating that for them, including this person. His name, after he embraced Islam, he took the name Rais Murad, right? So Rais means sort of, it's the word used for captain in a lot of those Mediterranean Muslim cultures, right? And Murad is obviously like, it's a well-known sort of Muslim name from that region as well. The mother's name is Margarita, right? Like I said. And they get married and they have several children, one of whom is this person named Anthony. And 2 years after Anthony is born, the Moriscos, they're actually living in Spain, right? But they are expelled. So now the Moriscos were people they outwardly said we are Christian, but they actually retained their Islam secretly just to save their lives. So they pretended to be Christian. Now they said even any Morisco communities, any community with any kind of connection, to Islam or Muslims is going to be expelled. So that order is given in Spain in the year 1609, 2 years after Anthony is born in Spain. And so now these people are looking for new places to go. And one of these new places that they can find to go and settle in is this new colony established by the Dutch known as New Netherlands, right? New Amsterdam. New York is the name it got much later on, right? Manhattan, Harlem, all of these are you have the Holland Tunnel. There's a lot of Dutch history in this entire region because they came and settled it first after the indigenous people who lived here. So because he has that Dutch background as well, they're able to fit in this place in New Netherlands. So in 1630, Anthony comes to what is today New York, and he becomes a very prosperous farmer and landowner. He owns a lot of land, first in Manhattan, right? And then later on, more prominently, even more land he owns in what is known as Brooklyn. He has this huge land, and he's credited with a few things. He's the first person to bring cherry trees to this region and have a cherry tree plantation, which was known as the Turk's plantation, because he was known as the Turk, even though he wasn't necessarily Turkish in any way, but they just called everyone who was Muslim as Turk. So he's the first non-indigenous person to own land in Coney Island, I apologize, and also Bosvik, or however you pronounce that, in Dutch, which became Bushwick. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this place. I haven't been there, right? but you guys know. Now, there's a few other things we know about him. He was very quarrelsome. He got into fights a lot. He was very tall. He was unusually tall, which makes sense because Dutch men on average are the tallest out of any other nationality in the whole world, right? He was known for being very strong, like physically strong, and he was known for carrying his Quran. He had a copy of the Quran, and he would frequently read from that Quran, right? Sadly, he wasn't able to pass on Islam to future generations of his family, who would be some very, very, very famous people in American history, in the history of New York, right? The people who, some of the names, you go through the list, right? So you have like the Vanderbilts, right, who built a lot of things. That's not the builts in their name, but they built a lot of things. The Grand Central Terminal in New York, and many, many other, like the largest mansions in the New York area, etc. Jacqueline Kennedy, right, the wife of President John F. Kennedy, right? So she was a descendant of his. Anderson Cooper, the CNN journalist, is a descendant of his, right? So several very influential and famous people in America have been descendants of this Muslim who settled here. And in fact, even though they did not retain Islam for many centuries, the Quran, his personal copy of the Quran, continued to be passed down from generation to generation, even though they weren't Muslim, but they knew this belonged to their ancestor, until ultimately, I guess there was no interest in the family in keeping it, and it was auctioned off, right? And so that is a story that I wanted to start with because it shows you the connection of the global and the local, right? So when we are sitting in Long Island, right, when we are sitting in New York City and we are talking about the history of a faraway place in Spain, it's important to try to make the local connections. How does this relate to me personally? Hopefully that new information that you just learned will stay with you, right, about the history of Muslims in New York. That's where it began, with that first individual who was known as Anthony the Turk. And there's a lot of records about him. If you go to the Brooklyn Museum, I think it's called, you can actually see the original copy of that document that I showed you in the slide earlier, which was the grant, the land grant that he was given by the government, that you own the land and you have to start the plantation on Coney Island, what became Coney Island, eventually. But let's go way back. So how does this whole relationship with Spain of the Muslims begin, with that land, right? It's called Hispaniola, right? It's called Iberia. There are different names for it. And of course, when we say Spain, it's a modern day country. What we're really talking about is that region, right? So there's bits of France in there. There's certainly Portugal, right beside Spain. It's part of the peninsula. And there's Morocco. Morocco has always had a natural sort of geographical and historical connection with Spain as well. And we can break it down into key periods. So what you see up there is a breakdown of sort of Spanish history through the Muslim period, right? And I'm going to give you a few like bits and pieces of information about each. I don't want to focus too much on the details of the history. So we're not here to memorize dates, right? We're not here to memorize names. We're here to find a general sense of the history and to find inspiration in the history of the Muslims in Spain. So early on is the conquest, right? So the conquest happens very, very early on. The year 711 is just a few decades after the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if you recall from what you have learned elsewhere, the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Muslims controlled Medina, they controlled the Hijaz region, and not very much beyond that. Other parts of Arabia, other tribes had pledged allegiance to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but that's where they were. And within just a few decades, the Muslims are now raiding into Spain and actually into France, a significant degree into France. So we'll talk about that. Then comes the Umayyad Emirate, right? Or the Imarat Umayyah and the Caliphate of Cordoba. So you have this period, which is sort of the cultural flourishing, right? The culture is flourishing of the Muslims in Spain. You have the Muluk al-Tawaif after that, which is literally means the petty kingdoms, like just petty infighting among the Muslims. And when we talk about Spain falling or the Muslims losing control of Muslim Spain in the 1490s, right? All that time has passed by then. There have been centuries of this infighting, of this division, right? And that's like part of the lesson that I'm going to say a few times, like never get too comfortable. What happens is when Muslim communities become large and they become prominent, what do? We tend to get more comfortable, right? So when you talk to or when you hear the stories or learn the stories about early Muslims who came to the cities like America, right? Or they came to like in Canada and in other places, people were together. It doesn't really matter if you're Sunni or Shia, as long as you're Muslim at that point, they would come together because at least you had some similarity. It doesn't matter if you're Hanafi or Shafi'i or Maliki, right? It doesn't matter if you're like, brown or if you're Arab or these things. And then when communities start to grow, what happens is we start to become very comfortable. Now we're untouchable. You know what I mean? Now we're good. We have a beautiful masjid, right? This masjid is absolutely beautiful, mashallah, but what they had in Spain was much, much better than this. The position that the Muslims were in Spain, they were ruling Spain for centuries. They were in a much, much better position there than the Muslims in New York or Toronto or anywhere else in the West will be for decades, generations to come. And you can never get too comfortable, right? The moment those divisions start seeping in, now everyone's like, well, I don't need you, right? I don't need my brothers and sisters. I don't need Muslims of that background. We can have our own masjid over here. We're not going to work with them. We're not going to tolerate these people. We're not going to agree with these people on anything. It can all fall apart very, very easily. And to this day, we feel bad. We all feel bad that Spain is not a Muslim land, right? Even though it was for so many centuries. So Muluk al-Tawawi is when this really starts to take shape, when you have, instead of a centralized sort of organized community in Spain that spreads over a significant amount of land, that covers a significant amount of people, you have local city-states, right? This state is fighting with that state. Cordoba doesn't get along with Granada and Toledo, and they're all having their own little thing happening everywhere. And it's so easy for someone to divide and conquer. They don't even have to worry about the divide part because you're already divided among yourselves. All they have to do is come in and exploit those divisions and then conquer you. It's going to happen, right? There was a bit of resurgence with some Moroccan dynasties, the Al-Murabitun and Al-Muwahhidun, right? So you see these two dynasties, they kind of came back into Spain and tried to push a little bit of a resurgence, but they had their own issues. Again, I don't want to go into like the complex politics and all of that of history. That's not what we're here for. And then finally, the last stand of the Muslims was in Granada, in the city of Granada, right in southern Spain, on the southern tip of Spain, ruled by the Nasrid dynasty. And they held out for quite a while until 1492. Right? In 1492, Granada finally falls. It's the last Muslim city-state that still exists, right? There's a guy who's waiting in the Christian camp. He's waiting for the war to end very eagerly. His name is Christopher Columbus. He's waiting outside the city of Granada, hoping this war will end because he has an idea that he wants to bring up to the Christian powers, and they say, we can't let you discuss, we don't have time to discuss that with you until this war is over. So he's just waiting and probably praying for the war to end. The war does end. Within a few weeks, Christopher Columbus is talking, to Ferdinand and Isabella, these two Christian rulers, and they give him permission and they give him the support he needs to begin his first voyage to India, right? And he got lost and he ended up here or somewhere else, right, in the Caribbean. And then you have this period called the Spanish Golden Age right after that. And that's important to keep in mind as well. So while there is now persecution of Muslims happening, during this period, Muslims have lost all political control in Al-Andalus, and there is persecution happening. The culture that the Muslims had established for so long is still continuing to benefit even the people who are oppressing the Muslims at the same time, right? So this is how powerful, it's a tragic situation. And of course, they were being unjust. They were being unjust in many ways, and Allah holds everyone to account, right? But at the same time, it's important to think about all of the potential reach of our legacy when we intend to do something good, right? So even the Spanish Golden Age, why is it that right after they end Muslim rule, they continue, their golden age begins right after, despite all this destruction, because they're inheriting all of this culture, and that's going to be crucial for the first sort of European kingdom that's going to establish a presence in the New World, in the United States, right? All these places have Spanish names, right? Florida, California, huge Spanish presence in American culture as well, and certainly in Latin America. So we'll talk about all of that, inshallah. If you can go to the next slide, please. So let's go to a bit of the conquest of Al-Andalus, right? So what are we talking about here? The conquest really begins with the campaigns of Uqba ibn Nafi al-Fihri in North Africa, right? And this is someone who is from the generation of the Tabi'een. Very early on, they continue to push their way through what is now modern-day Tunisia, into Algeria, into Morocco. And then once you're in Morocco, Spain is right there, right across what are known as the Straits of Gibraltar. The conquest of Spain begins in the month of Ramadan in the year 711 in the Common Era in our calendar that we use. And what's interesting is that what kind of motivated this conquest? So you have this Berber general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, right? Sort of well-known name in Islamic history. So you have Tariq ibn Ziyad, this Berber general stationed in Morocco, and he actually gets a request from one of the nobles, one of the Spanish Christian nobles, crosses over and requests from Tariq ibn Ziyad to help him against an unjust Christian ruler. And in particular, the unjust Christian ruler is trying to forcibly marry the daughter of the noble, right? So he's trying to make this marriage happen, and the noble does not want that marriage to happen. And so he crosses over, asks Tariq ibn Ziyad for help, and they don't need another pretext. So Tariq ibn Ziyad, he crosses over, right, with the force. And you'll hear many famous stories about this. Many of them are untrue, or they're not, at best, they're not very well verified. So you hear things like, he burnt all the ships because they didn't want to turn back, and he did this and he did that. Just be careful before you circulate something like that, because it might not be true. I don't want to go through like all the stories. There are so many of them because he's so famous in Islamic history, right? So people kind of just juice up the story a little bit in different ways as time goes on. This is how this conquest begins. He's Amazigh, he's Berber, like we said, and the governor is the Umayyad governor Musa ibn Nusayr, so another name that you will come across if you read more into the history. And the Christian noble that we talked about, his name is, we would say Julian, right, but is Julian in the sources. And the key battles here, that two of them to keep in mind, is the Battle of Guadalete in 711, and then the Battle of Tours in 732. So between 711 and 732 is when this conquest really, establishes itself. So you have Tariq ibn Ziyad leading the army at the Battle of Guadalete against the Visigoths, right? We'll talk about that in a second. At the Battle of Tours, Tours is in France, right? Tours is just a couple of 100 miles out of Paris. So the Muslims, we'll see in a map in a second, actually reach that far up. The distance between the top tip of Scotland and Tours is less than the distance between Tours and where they had started in Gibraltar, which means Jabal Tariq, by the way, is the anglicized form. Gibraltar, that place, that country, is Jabal Tariq. But the point is that that's how far they sort of penetrated into Europe in that initial thrust of the conquest. And where did this name Al-Andalus come from, right? So it's first used on these Latin Arabic coins that you can see in 716. So you have the Shahada actually. That's the Shahada written in Latin, right, when these coins are first minted in Spain. And the name, it's unclear where it comes from, but there are theories that it comes from like the Vandals, this particular group of nomadic tribes that had come to rule and who the Muslims fought against at the Battle of Guadalete. Or it could come actually from the name Atlantis, which was known at the time, right? Or it could be other names. It's not clear where Al-Andalus actually comes from. We can go to the next slide, please. Oh, not this one. Can we go one back? And there we go, the map. So just to put it on a map, you see the campaigns, first of all, in North Africa of Uqba ibn Nafi that start this off. And I want to point out a few things on this map, right? The first thing is this very important island. When we talk about the history of Spain, one island that's very important to keep in mind is Sicily. You guys have heard of Sicily before, right? It's part of Italy now, right? Sicily was also ruled by Muslims for several hundred years, right? And there's a rich, even in the language of the Sicilians to this day, it's part of Italy now, but there is a certain Arabic thread in their language. And it's important to keep Sicily in mind because Sicily is where the European powers gained their confidence that they can conquer land back from the Muslims. Sicily was the very first land before any other land that the Christians conquered back from the Muslims after the Muslims had sort of established their control in it, right? After that came the Crusades. So Sicily gave them the confidence. After that, they got the confidence for the Crusades. After that, they got the confidence to really push back into Spain. If so the lesson there is how important it is to be mindful of what is happening across the ummah, right? If the challenge is, and I do a lot of history talks on a lot of different topics, when we talk about Islamic history, the first challenge is geography. If I ask, someone, can you please point out where the Uyghur Muslims actually live? It's very difficult for a lot of people, right? Where do the Rohingya actually live? Do we know the ummah? Before we talk about uniting the ummah, before we're talking about being one ummah, can we even find the ummah on a world map? Do we know where Muslims are, where they live, what their challenges are, what kind of struggles they are going through? Do we find out about Muslim issues when the New York Times reports about it? Or do we already know because we've already gone out and have that concern to go out and use some of our spare time to keep up with what's going on in different parts of the Muslim world and see how we can support Muslims in different places, right? Or do we pick up on the story? Does our activism begin when it becomes a popular thing in the news media or on social media, right? When Sicily was falling, all the other, even in North Africa, even in Spain, everywhere, it was the story kind of was, okay, this is very tragic, but no big deal, we'll get it back. They never got it back. Muslims never ruled Sicily again. And what in fact happened is that the people who conquered this small island, right, were so emboldened by the process. And there's a horrible story of how it got conquered in the same divide and conquer kind of theme, right, about how easily the Muslims and their differences were exploited against them until all of them completely lost everything they had. But everyone was like, okay, no big deal. Like, we got good things happening in Spain. It would never happen here. Right? Oh, the Muslims somewhere else are suffering. Oh, Muslims in New York would be fine. So, we don't really have to think about anywhere else kind of thing. You know what I mean? So this concern is extremely important. Keep this island in mind and actually try to look it up how the Muslims gained Sicily and how they lost Sicily, right? But that's where the emboldened kind of action comes from the Christian side. You can see the extent of Muslim rule in Spain. You can see the Iberian Peninsula there. You can see it says Umayyad Caliphate is kind of cut off because initially it was part of that central empire with the capital in Damascus. And you can also see how far into, if you look at the very top there, how far into France they raided, right? So the city of Tours. So this was actually called the Highway of Martyrs. A lot of Muslim soldiers were martyred in these battles with the French during that early conquest. So this entire road that goes, from Zaragoza all the way up to Tours was actually known in Arabic as the Highway of Martyrs. A lot of Muslims were killed along that route, right? But really, Muslims weren't able to establish any kind of stronghold in France, except for the very, very southern part, which is called Narbonne, right? And they were able to establish a very strategic entrance to the Alps. So you guys have heard of the Alps, the mountains, right? People go skiing there, and Switzerland and all of these things, in northern Italy, etc. The next Winter Olympics are going to be held there, right, in northern Italy. The Muslims controlled a very important pass that leads through the Alps that connects basically France to Italy, right? An important mountain pass. And they controlled it. It's amazing. With this very, just a couple of castles controlled by the Muslims for nearly a century, they're able to control that entire pass, right? So strategic positioning is important in our work, in our geography, where we place things, where we build the next masjid. All of these things are things to think about, right? The impact of building your masjid like here compared to 5 blocks down might be completely different over time. How much thought is actually going into this every decision? Someone decided, maybe we won't push in other directions, But this one pass is definitely important for Muslims to rule, and Muslims did control it and rule it for 100 years. And that brought a lot of benefits. It brought a lot of protection for Muslims in other parts, right? So in which ways do we channel our energy is another important conversation to have. Another thing you'll notice, of course, is some of the cities. I'm not sure how well you can read them, but these are some of the major cities of Muslim Spain. You have Granada, right? You have Cordoba. You have Lisbon, which is now the capital of Portugal. There's a lot of, sort of repurposed Islamic history there. A lot of masjids have been turned into churches and things like that, but you can very clearly tell that this building was at one point a masjid if you actually go there, right? You have Madrid, Zaragoza, Valencia. So if you read in more detail about Muslim Spain, you will come across these cities. It's just a good idea to get a sense of the map, the situation. And of course, you have all of these major cities in Morocco just below it, right? You have Tangier, you have Fez, right? You're going to have these cities from which there will constantly be a back and forth with the Muslims in Spain in a good way and sometimes in a way of adversity as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about a few Muslim rulers. I'm going to talk about a few individuals to be mindful of. The first one is Abdul Rahman, right, known as the Falcon of Quraysh. So he was Qurashi. He was from the Umayyad dynasty, Abdul Rahman the First. He escaped the Abbasid revolution. So when the Abbasids came in and they removed the Umayyads, he was a Umayyad prince, and he had this incredible escape story that someone should make a Netflix series or some kind of documentary or something on it, because it's this crazy story of how narrowly he escapes, and he escapes to Spain, where there are still people loyal to the Umayyads, and he's able to re-establish himself as the ruler of Cordoba. So he's the Emir of Cordoba, right? And he begins the construction of his famous masjid, that masjid you see that tour goes to, right, with the arches, right, and that design. So he begins the construction of that. And in many ways, because he was personally a person of culture, he was very interested in not just in politics, not just in war, but he really loved culture, and he patronized people who were producing, literature and poetry and excelling in math and science and all of these different things. He sets this culture of Al-Andalus, right, that will continue for a very long time after him, right? So he's very influential in that sense. Next slide, please. And a few of the people, it's always important, to keep in mind which groups don't duly get represented in history. When we're talking about history, the first one that always comes to mind, obviously, is women. So before I get to any of this person contributed this and that, what did the women of Al-Andalus that we know of contribute to that society and, their legacy even to this day in terms of contribution? So we have a person named Lubna of Cordoba. You can see sort of the dates of when she flourished. So she lived around the 960s. She's a slave of Spanish origin, right? So she is a Spaniard. And she became one of the most important figures in the Umayyad palace. She's the secretary of Abdul Rahman III, right? Not the first, the third in the same dynasty. And more importantly, Al-Hakam, his son, right? And Al-Hakam was, again, a man of culture, right? A leader who really, really emphasized the importance of culture. And she became a skilled mathematician. So after starting off as a slave, she grows and she is given this support and she's given this opportunity to become a skilled mathematician, presiding over the Royal Library, which was the largest library in the world at the time in the city of Cordoba. And in fact, she had to, move around and actually curate books for the library. So going to places like Cairo, finding out what the best books are available, making sure they get shipped back, the entire process of building and maintaining this library. And it contained over 500,000 books. At the time, in which if you were to go to nearby France, or if you were to go to the UK or Italy or something like that, you would have to go to a monastery and might be lucky if you find maybe 5 books, like 5 bound books, right? And not just a bunch of scrolls and things like that. So 500,000 books are present at this library, and it's not the only library in Cordoba at this time in the 900s. She excelled, as you can see the quote from the historian there, in writing, in grammar, in poetry, her knowledge of mathematics. Thank you. And she was proficient in sort of many other disciplines as well, and known for her nobility. So you can see the quote there. A few other people to keep in mind is this physician. So she's a tabiba, Zainab. We don't know anything else about her except that she played this role within that society, and she's described as an early ophthalmologist. And then you have this very interesting family of physicians, of these doctors, right? So you have Rufayda al-Aslamiyya, right, and her daughter al-Hassan. They're both physicians from Sevilla, right? This very well-known sort of city even today. And they're related to Ibn Zuhr, who's another very, very famous physician. If you've read Harry Potter and you've seen the Bezoar stone, it's named after this person. That entire process of how you use the Bezoar stone, etc. J.K. Rowling somehow found out about this and she included it in her book in Harry Potter, right? But she never gave us credit, so we'll have to figure out a way to get that from her and make sure that happens, right? But it's named after Ibn Zuhr, and actually the way that recipe is described in the books as well is also described by this famous physician Ibn Zuhr. So next slide, please. A few, some famous names, some not so famous. I guess Ibn Rushd is very, very famous. In the history of philosophy, not just in Islamic history, even in the West, right? There are these famous paintings by people who hated Muslims and things like that, in which they have to give due recognition to Ibn Rushd and what he did for Europe in particular, right? Very, very important individual. So he's a polymath, meaning he excels in many different fields, like a long, long list, right, of things he excelled in. He became the chief judge and the court physician for the Al-Muwahhidun dynasty, the Al-Muhads, as they're known in English, which I mentioned earlier. And he's sometimes called the father of rationalism. And particularly in Spain is where this conversation was very, I guess, prominent, you could say, about the relationship between revelation and reason, right? What is the relationship? How are we to kind of reconcile these two things and find a way to kind of balance between the two? Should a balance be needed? Does revelation become the only source and we don't need to rely upon reason? All of these questions were explored by these philosophers like Ibn Rushd, and he was a famous physician as well. And this knowledge was going to get passed on to Europe, so we'll talk about one more example of that. Al-Qalasadi is also very interesting because he's a mathematician, and what's interesting about him is that we often think that Muslims only thrived when the situation was very, very good. Don't get me wrong, when the situation is good for the Muslim community, that is when Muslims will thrive the most. But that does not mean that when we're struggling, we're not able to achieve anything. So we hear this argument a lot. You'll hear very, very ridiculous things, even from academics. Imam Ghazali kind of got Muslims to stop studying mathematics. That's why there was a decline in science after him, et cetera, like a bunch of rubbish, right, basically. And so when we talk about Muslims, even in that period of decline, making these incredible contributions, Al-Qalasadi is one of those examples. So as Muslim Spain is falling, as he himself is becoming a refugee, his own situation is so volatile, he's making these incredible contributions. So he develops a system of mathematical notation. He writes a few books on different religious topics as well. He explained algebra using long poems. So he actually explained the rules of algebra in the form of a poem to help basically anyone who's learning them memorize it more easily. And he had several other contributions as well. And it's said about him that he studied the Quran more than anything else. So he's a mathematician, he's a poet, he's many things, but the thing he studied the most, his source of inspiration, his source of guidance was the Quran. He studied the Quran more than anything else. And you see a few more famous names here, right? Ibn Hazm, he's a polymath who wrote on many, many different topics, right? Especially he was sort of a Dini scholar in that sense. So he wrote a lot about different aspects of religion. Ibn Arabi is a name you might have heard, right? Not a lot of people entirely agree with his teachings, right? There's differences of opinion and things like that. All of that is respectable. What is important to recognize is how influential he was in Islamic thought, right? So those of you who have watched Ertugrul, right? You've seen that version of Ibn Arabi, even though he never went to Turkey. None of that ever happened, right? I'm sorry to break it to you. That's not like real history, but that influence is there. Why drag him into it? Right? When you have Maulana Rumi living at the same time, at the same place as Ertugrul, why not bring him into it? I don't know why they make those decisions, but it's important to recognize his influence. And Imam al-Qurtubi. someone you will hear about again and again and again in religious conversations, right? Famous for his tafsir al-Qurtubi. And it's said about him, and I believe this is a quote from Imam al-Zahabi, he says, he was an imam versed in numerous branches of scholarship, an ocean of learning, whose works testify to the wealth of his knowledge and the width of his intelligence. Like very, very highly praised among the ulama in our history. Next slide, please. And because we are in a pandemic situation, hopefully not for too much longer, I do want to, there were some interesting contributions, made to epidemiology, the study, the understanding of epidemics, right, or pandemics, whatever the case may be, depending on the scale. So I wanted to share a few examples related to that. There's a lot more information on this topic, right, about what Muslims contributed, Ibn Sina and many of these famous physicians, everything that they did to help us understand pandemics and epidemics. But what about Al-Andalus specifically? So the first is from sort of a spiritual perspective, right? Or you might say like a mental health perspective, a mental well-being perspective, is the advice of a scholar named Ibn Khatima, who says, in the experience of a pandemic, this is what you should do. It is best for the spirit to experience joy, serenity, relaxation, and hope. So any activity that is lawful, of course, anything that's halal that you can do that gives you those things, you should absolutely seek it in this very trying kind of circumstances. And no shame in saying this. He says, otherwise there are history books. So he gives you a few examples of things you can do. So you can read history. You can read joke books, in a sense, humorous works, things that make you laugh, things that help you relax, etc. You can read love stories, things that, again, they give you a certain emotional kind of feeling that will, give you that resurgence that you need in those difficult times. And he says you should seek pleasant and attractive company, and the best companion is the Quran. Right, and one common thread to keep in mind while we are going through all this history, we talked about Anthony the Turk, what comes up, his Quran. Right? We talked about Al-Qalasadi, what did he read most? The Quran, right? We read here, if there's a pandemic, these scholars who are very experienced in a lot of different life experiences and all of these things, what are they recommending? Quran. The best company is the Quran. So when you look in Islamic history, it's something for us to reflect on as individuals. What is my relationship with the Quran, right? If someone was to write my biography right now about all of the years that I have lived in this world, all my experiences, how often would the Quran be mentioned? How much of what I do is inspired by the Quran, right? How much am I engaging with the Quran? What has the Quran sort of done for me, and how have I sort of given the Quran its due right upon me, right? These are questions to sort of keep in mind. And Ibn al-Khatib is very, very important because in Islamic history, there's some confusion. Even when this pandemic began, there were some conversations about certain ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ related to contagion. Can disease spread from me to my brother over here? May Allah protect both of us, right? Can disease spread among us, right? From person to person? Or the general theory at the time was the disease is in the air, like it's just in the dome over here, and it's affecting each of us individually. So it's not that, I gave it to the brother who gave it to the next brother by sneezing, or something who gave it to the next brother, right? The way is just in the air, and it's affecting everyone differently based on their health. So this was known as the theory of miasma, right? Miasma meaning bad air. So the air is bad. That's how diseases are spreading. That's how epidemics are spreading. And Ibn al-Khatib, this physician, this poet, this politician from Al-Andalus, was one of the first people very, very early on, if you think about the grand scheme of history, to say we are reading the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in the wrong way, right? He says, we have to look at the observable evidence that clearly shows us that contagion is a real thing. Disease is spreading from person to person, right? And then we have to not reject the hadith. So it's not like, okay, now we don't believe in the hadith because we see something different and the hadith says something else. No, we are probably seeing a reality and we are misunderstanding the hadith. So we have to revisit that and see what is the proper way to understand that hadith, right? So he comes up with this very, very interesting kind of theory from an Islamic perspective of contagion, that contagion is a real thing. And he says many Muslims actually believe in it within that Andalusi context. They actually practice it. They know at a time when not much of the world actually acknowledges that there's such thing as contagiousness, there's such thing as contagion. And very interestingly, his work was one of the few works by Muslims that the Christians did not destroy when they conquered Spain. So they did produce, again, what I was mentioning earlier about that Spanish Golden Age, right? That Spanish Golden Age, all of the discoveries, right? All of the sort of conquering of the conquistadors in Latin America, and all of that was enabled by this legacy that they inherited. And that's something for us to reflect on, because there were harmful effects as well, right? And I was doing another talk, and one of the questions that came up was, you can make a contribution, but it might go the wrong way. What about military technology? Should Muslims be working on something like military technology, right? So if when rockets were first invented, the Mysorean rocket, the rocket that's mentioned in your national anthem and the rocket's red glare, they're talking about the Mysorean rockets invented by Tipu Sultan in India, right? So those are the rockets they're referring to. Now this guy invents this military technology that is used in an anti-colonial struggle against the British. And then of course, all kinds of horrible things have been done with rockets, right? We know this, but also rockets have enabled space exploration and communication and many of the beautiful things in life that we enjoy as well, right? So the point is, it's very hard to see the actual, trajectory, no pun intended with the rockets, right? The actual trajectory of what it is that you do, where it's going to end up, right? Your contribution. But the important thing is to actually be thoughtful about it. Don't just do things loosely. I shouldn't just do things loosely. I shouldn't just throw together this presentation, be like, yeah, I'm going to go there. I'm going to say a few things about Al-Andalus, see what happens, see where it goes. No, I should be thinking about every word on this slide. What is the possibility? Allah knows the future. I don't know the future, but what is the range of possibilities that people might understand or misunderstand something from what I have done here? And that should go in every aspect of our life. We should be very, very thoughtful of every single thing that we do. Right? It's hard, but it's also necessary. So you see a painting there of Ibn al-Khatib, who did this work on contagion. So he was an artist. In fact, if you go to the Alhambra Palace, you can see his poetry. Some of the poetry he wrote is engraved into the wall. So some of that Arabic text, even on our poster, right, that you saw the poster up for this event, some of that Arabic text is his poetry. Sadly, he lived a very difficult life because of his involvement in politics, but he made these enormous sort of contributions in Islamic history. Next slide, please. Speaking of enormous contributions, we come back to philosophy and medicine. So we're not going to go for too long here. We're about to switch gears right after this, actually. We're going to talk about good old America, right? So we're about to leave Spain. It's not a comprehensive history of Muslims in Spain. But this is a very important contribution that came out of Spain. Ibn Tufayl is a philosopher and a physician in Spain, and he writes this book called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, which means alive, son of the awake. That's the title of the book, and that's the title of the main character. And this is a philosophical novel, and historians of literature say this is the first novel written in human history, right? So this is the first novel, and it's not just like, me saying that. Historians of literature actually say that. And he's advocating for many things. And what's interesting here is not just, he made a contribution. Many people make contributions, right? But the creativity, the creative process involved, right? And the thoughtfulness that he's putting into it. I have to communicate an idea, and we do this a lot too, right? I have to communicate the message of Islam. I'm going to give da'wah. How am I going to do that? I'm going to make a very lame looking pamphlet, write a bunch of text on it, right? And make it like as, avoidable as possible. And then try to get someone to grab the pamphlet for me. Like that's how I'm going to give da'wah to people, right? Where is the creativity? Where is the sort of diligence, the thought process of, no, what works, what actually attracts people, right? This is one of the most influential people in human history, Ibn Tufayl. And a lot of that has to do not because he had the most unique idea in the world, but he had the most unique form of presentation. So when we're trying to communicate something, how do we do it? Not just what we say, but how do we say it? What is our, for lack of a better term, marketing? How do we promote Islam? How do we market Islam within the society, within New York, within the specific context in which we live? right? So he writes this novel, and the novel is very interesting. It's basically a story of a young child, a baby is left on an island in the Indian Ocean. Somehow the baby is abandoned on an island, no human beings, nothing, just the baby, and there are animals. So the baby is raised by a deer, right? Um, and ultimately, the baby grows up in the care of the deer, but the deer mother of the baby passes away, right? And this is a first time experience, close up experience for someone the baby considers, the baby being Hay, the main character, right? He considers it his mother. So he's very shocked by this entire experience, right? He's trying to figure out what happened to her. She doesn't move anymore. She's just lying still. What has happened to this only mother he has ever known? And this sets him off on a journey to discover basically the reality of life. What is life, right? I knew my mother. I remember her since I can remember anything. I remember she was always there. And then one day she just collapsed and she was gone, right? And he was one of the first advocates for autopsy, for medical purposes, cutting the body and exploring what's inside, what went wrong, right? Because in most cultures, in many cultures, it's considered disrespectful to the deceased to cut the body for research purposes or anything like that. We have these kinds of conversations too about organ donations and is this allowed? So we kind of still grapple with those questions. But he advocated that yes, that should be done. Autopsy should be done to help with understanding. But that was the side point of his novel. The real point is what is called autodidactism, which is can you teach yourself if there's no sources available? There's no books, there's no one to talk to, right? There's no YouTube lectures about Islam, there's nothing. If a person has nothing, can they still come to the realization that Allah exists? That is sort of the question he's trying to answer in novel form, right? And so he goes through this process basically of reflecting on nature around him, reflecting on his own life, his own memories. He's reflecting on everything. Hey, as he grows up, now without his dear mother, he's on his own. He has to figure things out. Sorry?
There is a movie about that.
Is there? Yeah. Okay, I'll talk to you after about that. I didn't know there's a movie. But so we can watch the movie as well. That's great to hear. Alhamdulillah. And so, it's important to recognize, like I said, not just the point he's making, but the way in which he is making this point. And he does come to the realization that Allah is a reality. Allah exists just by reflecting upon nature. But after that, he meets humans from society. Someone else ends up on the island. And then he realizes the importance of revelation, right? So not that it's impossible for a person who has never been exposed to any kind of literature or other human beings to realize or know anything about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he realizes the importance of revelation for a person to have that guiding source, in their lives, and for society certainly to have that guidance. Hugely influential in Europe, this book. Hugely, hugely influential. The number of translations you can see there, it's the third most translated text from Arabic after the Quran and obviously the 1001 Nights into European languages, right? No other book has been translated more except for the Quran and the 1001 Nights, than Hay ibn Yaqzan into European languages. You see those names there, you probably remember them from school. You see John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Isaac Newton, Immanuel Kant, they're all reading these books, right? Or this particular book, I should say. So it's hugely influential in that entire process of the Renaissance and scientific revolution. Why? Because they use this book to argue, just like he himself is using the book to argue, that reason is not necessarily anti-God, anti-religion, right? He says we can use our reason, we can use our reflection upon nature and upon our own existence to actually come to the realization that Allah does exist, Allah is a reality. That's what Ibn Tufayl was arguing, right? And they were, because of the ongoing debates in Europe, right, about science and religion and the differences between them, there was a lot of tension there. And this book helped guide some of that. And the other interesting thing, from the literary perspective, is you can see up on the slide there, Robinson Crusoe is the first novel in the English language published in the UK, or what became the UK, basically in England, about a century and a half after Hay ibn Yaqzan is published, and it's the exact same story, right? And that, being abandoned in the wilderness and coming of age theme has continued in Western culture to this day. That same story format that Ibn Tufail introduced, right? So stories like Tarzan, Jungle Book, right? That show, The Lost, right? That's what it was called. The Martian, all of these movies about a person being abandoned, and in abandoning, right, or in abandonment, I should say, when they're in isolation and finally they're clear of all the noise, they have nothing, no access, no communication, right? They're just on their own. That's when they really start to notice their surroundings and really start to drive towards certain conclusions about the realities which exist around them. And the ultimate reality is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So moving on, like I said, we're done with Spain. Obviously not a comprehensive history, but we're going to move towards the Americas, right? So here goes the transition. From Al-Andalus, Muslims traveled quite a bit. So you have this famous individual, Al-Ghazal, right? He traveled to Byzantium, he traveled to the Viking court. So the Vikings especially are important in this entire history, right? Because they constantly had sort of engagement, both conflict and cooperation with the Muslims in Al-Andalus. And so we hear from time to time about, these sort of traces of Muslim Islamic influence in Viking culture. So that's an important connection to keep in mind. I won't go into detail. Did the Spanish Muslims explore the Atlantic, right? This is a question that historians are still sort of grappling with. For the most part, they referred to the Atlantic as Bahr al-Zulumat, the Sea of Darkness, or the encompassing sea, right? The Sea of Darkness because it was so unexplored, and the encompassing sea because they did not believe that there was something known as the Americas, right? They too, like Columbus, thought that if they sailed further enough, right, they would go all the way around the world and they would end up in sort of the East Indies, basically, right? But there were some individuals, there were some adventurous sort of individuals that went out, and certainly from West Africa as well, but I'll focus on sort of the Spanish experience for now. So Al-Mas'udi, very early on, so he died in 956, he records a young Andalusi man named Khashkhash of Cordoba who led an expedition into the Atlantic Ocean, and he was gone for a long time, and he returned with a lot of wealth and stories, but sadly, the stories is generic enough that we can't really verify. Like he could have ended up on one of the small islands like the Azores or something else, right, in the Atlantic Ocean, or he might have ended up in Africa or something and he brought back all of these things. So it's unconfirmed. It's just a curiosity to keep in mind. There are other reports from Lisbon, like I said, an important sort of city in Islamic history in the region, of people going into the Atlantic Ocean and coming back. And even for Columbus, right? Like when we talk about that entire story, he was in that context. He was in Granada as Granada was falling, right? He was in the Alhambra. The deal that he signed with Ferdinand and Isabella was signed in the Muslims' palace of the Alhambra. So he's inheriting all of this knowledge, all of this information that is going to sort of enable him to make these journeys. Where is this information coming from, right? So there's a lot more about sort of what we can say about Muslims and even predicting the Americas. So to keep this name in mind, Al-Biruni was in Central Asia. He was actually in Pakistan, in sort of the Nandana region, right? And he measured the circumference of the earth, and he actually speculated, not based on evidence, but he speculated that a landmass has to exist in this huge ocean that we imagine. A landmass of significant size has to exist based on his knowledge of geography. This is 1,000 years ago from our time, right? And he also said that it's possible that people lived there based on the geography, right? So he's predicting, he's speculating about the Americas, speculating about the First Nations people while he's sitting on a mountain in Pakistan, quite literally, right? So it's the level of thinking, the level of sort of knowledge and ingenuity that's at work here that people like, and all of the tools that Columbus was using, even the people. So now you have Moriscos, because as the Christians reconquer Spain, right, again, the choices we mentioned earlier, you can either convert to Islam, or you can leave, or you can die, right? And so many of them, they fake these conversions to Islam, right? And they become known as the Moriscos. And they continue on in Spain for quite a long time, and we'll see some very interesting sort of inspiring as well as sad stories. But two of the Morisco people, the Pinzon brothers, were actually Muslims, right? And they, when it comes to that sighting of land, they sighted land. The person who became aware first that land had been sighted and told Columbus, because he was on the Santa Maria, he was on the same ship as Columbus, that land has been sighted, was one of these Muslim Pinzon brothers. So right from day one, right, for what it's worth, for better or for worse, because as we know, right, this is a very torturous history. I'm not saying this as like a matter of pride, that we are proud to we were on the same ship as Columbus, like Muslims were on that ship. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in a descriptive sense, right? That it's a reality that whatever Columbus was able to do, even if it was something horrible, was enabled by this Muslim, enormous, sort of overwhelming Muslim legacy in Spain that he was inheriting. And by the way, you see the Muslim references thing there, because when he got here, then he would describe everything. This is why we have all this confusion. Did Muslims come to America or to the Americas before Columbus? Because when he came here, he would say, oh, the indigenous people, they live in this kind of a building. He would call it a mosque, right? Or he would call their clothes like, oh, the Arabs wear these clothes. He constantly makes reference to things like this because this is his point of reference. This is what he's seen in Spain. These are the words he's using to describe things. And so this story continues, right? So two examples, just quickly, not just of Muslims, crypto Muslims, not Muslims who deal in crypto, right? I mean crypto Muslims in the sense that they were Moriscos, they were hiding their deen, right? And one of the places that they tried to escape persecution was this new door that had opened up. These new places like Mexico and Bolivia and Cuba, as they were being sort of explored, there's even this very interesting research about Muslim women who took part in the conquest of the Aztec people, right? These secret Morisca women, right, who took part in this entire process. They're known as the conquistadoras, right? So we won't go into detail with that, but let me just share a few examples with you. Al-Datil in Cuba, it means the date. Muslims introduced dates to Spain, right? The tamr, right? The khajur, that's what we're talking about here. They introduced it to Spain, and the first thing that the Spanish tried to introduce when they colonized Cuba in particular was the date. So they started these date plantations, except the indigenous people constantly destroyed them because they're fighting back to gain control of their homeland. Another sort of trace of Muslim culture is this rank in society known as al-mutajen, right? Which comes from the Arabic word al-muhtasib, right? Hisab. So in Muslim societies, you would have like sort of a person who was in charge of basically, maintaining the balance within society, in the sense that this was your public health person. They were in charge of making sure that the city got cleaned up, and everyone who needed access to certain utilities was getting that access, and all of these things. There was usually one individual in charge of a particular neighborhood, etc. It was called al-muhtasib, right? And so when the Spanish, they are obviously familiar with this concept. When they come to Mexico, for a long, long time, you have these people called al-mutajins in Mexico doing the exact same thing. The Muslim tradition carries on, right? You see the two other examples there are very interesting. I won't read everything, but you have in 1594, so keep in mind how early these stories are. In 1594, you have a woman living in Mexico. Her name is Maria Ruiz, right? And she confesses to the Inquisition that she secretly practiced Islam in Mexico for many years, right? And these were Morisca people. She was a child, right? And her parents were, whatever they were able to teach her of Islam, that's what she remembered. She said, when she was questioned, she said, I recite the halami, right? Now, what could this be? What does halami mean, right? Could it Bismillah, right? Is it Alhamdulillah? Does she mean kalima? Like it sounds like a few words that we are familiar with, right? And she says, I say that when I'm anxious, when I want to ask God for something, right? When I'm about to sleep or after I wake up. And then they asked her about the Trinity, right? Do you believe in, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? And she says, her only response was, there is only one God. I don't know any of these other things. All I know is there is only one God, right? In 1614, there's a village, right, in Mexico, and there's a card game that's being played between these fishermen. And one of these fishermen sort of gets frustrated during the card game by someone else who's bothering him. And he says, I guess as a moment of exasperation, he says, great will be Muhammad's paradise, right? This Christian person sitting in Mexico in this village, and he says, "Great will be Muhammad's paradise and those who believe in him. I believe in him." And his friends are all like, people he's playing with is like, okay, like that's funny, you know what I mean? Like whatever, you got angry or something and you said something crazy, but he kept repeating it. Something that was extremely dangerous to repeat within that society, because again, you will be persecuted by the Mexican Inquisition, right? Next slide, please. I just want to give you like a few other examples. This person you should absolutely know. This is a United States story, and it's the most incredible story. Mustafa Azammuri he was a black person from Morocco, and he was enslaved by the Spanish. He was captured and enslaved. Spanish was his language of communication. So culturally, he was Spanish, right? From that region, we said they're connected as before. He's captured and enslaved, and he's brought to New Spain, to the Caribbean in 1527, very, very early on, right? 1492 is when Columbus hit it by accident. So 1527, he's brought as part of this expedition to colonize what is today Florida. So Florida had not been colonized by the Europeans yet. So he comes as part of that. Expedition is a complete disaster, right? The indigenous people in Florida, and often I do want to mention this, when we talk about First Nations people, when we talk about indigenous people, we often have a very romanticized vision of them, right? Of they're just pure people, and they kind of there was nothing they could do to fight against them. Always keep in mind what really brought down the indigenous people in the Americas was disease. It wasn't their inability to fight back, right? It wasn't that they weren't able to defend their home. They just didn't have any defense against the diseases that the Europeans brought. They fought very hard. This expedition of hundreds of people, the way the survivors described it about the things that indigenous people did to them while trying to defend their home, right? It's like, it kind of gives you goosebumps just to read about like the ferocity involved in this process, right? So these were real people with a real civilization here long before any of us got here. The same human nature, the same human struggles. So we can't talk about them in some kind of romanticized way, they have like smoking traditions, and they have this and they have that, and they wear feathers and things like that. Very complex, very diverse, very, very interesting, high civilization people, and that included their ability to fight back, right? So Mustafa Azammuri, out of hundreds of people, is one of the 4 who survives. Several hundred people in this expedition, 4 of them survived. They actually raft in the Gulf of Mexico to escape, right? So they came on these mighty ships. We're going to conquer Florida, this and that. They left on these rafts that they were able to build at the last minute to escape. And they go all the way to what is now Galveston, Texas. That's where they wash up. And then for the next 8 years, Mustafa Azammuri walks across the southern United States. 8 years, because there's no directions, there's no maps, there's no nothing. America is completely unexplored, right? He has to get to Mexico City somehow. He doesn't speak the languages of the local indigenous people. It's like a first-time experience for him completely. So he's walking across, and he has for 8 years, he becomes a healer. He learns their languages. He uses his knowledge of medicine to heal a lot of the indigenous people, to build relationships. He becomes the leader of the 4 survivors. It's an incredible story, incredible true story of a Muslim here in the 1530s. And 8 years later, he finally makes it back to Mexico, right? And along the way, there's even stories, and some of the indigenous, the Pueblo indigenous people of Texas, they have this really interesting saying. They say that the first white man we saw was a black man because he was black. But they say the first white person we saw was black, right? So this is a saying that survives in their culture to this day, and they're referring to Mustafa Azammuri, right? And he, according to some of them, which they later told to the other Spaniards, he said, he taught us to pray at sunrise and sunset, right? So this entire conversation about was he still Muslim, etc. There's indications. We don't know for sure. Allah knows best, right? Next slide, please. Oh, and you can read the Moor's account. So if you ever hear about this book called the Moor's account, you saw the 2 books up there, hopefully. So you can read the non-fiction version, which is his story, and then the Moor's account is based on his story. Another very interesting case is this person, Amir Chiala, who went by the name of Captain Giorgio Zapata. He shows up in South America, in Bolivia, in 1561. Again, very, very early on. He's pretending to be Spanish, right? He speaks Spanish, he knows the language, everything, becomes a very, very rich and respected miner, right? So he gets into the silver mining. All these silver mines have been discovered. He becomes a miner. 15 years later, he tells his business partners and everything like that, you know what? I'm wrapping it up. I'm going home. They're like, that's great. You know, you can take your wealth or whatever, take it back to Spain, you know, give some to the king, etc. And he's like, exactly, that's what I'm going to do. Except the home that he's going to is Istanbul, because what turns out is he is Turkish. He's pretending to be Spanish for 15 years. He's pretending to be Christian for 15 years. He's secretly practicing Islam. So he goes back to Istanbul, right? He meets with Sultan Murad II of the Ottoman Empire. He gives him a share of the wealth that he has accumulated in Bolivia, right? He becomes an admiral in the Ottoman Navy and then becomes the governor of Algiers, right? Present-day Algeria. And this interesting story happens where his main partner, who he used to work with in Bolivia, ends up enslaved by his brother, by Emir Chiala's brother, right? So you can imagine this interaction where, Emir Chiala goes to visit his brother at his home, and, the brother is probably like, this is my new slave or something. You can imagine when they come face to face, it's like, I worked with this guy. He was my business partner in Bolivia for 15 years, right? And then, he's freed from slavery, obviously, and Emir Chiala tells him the truth. He says, for 15 years in Bolivia, I practiced Islam secretly. I did not let a single person find out that I was Muslim. I was practicing Muslim the entire time, and I accumulated all this wealth, and I came back home, right? And then he gives him a lot of that wealth as well, his partner, because his partner was captured, he lost everything. He gives his former partner a lot of the wealth as well. So you have this incredible story. His name turns out to be not Giorgio Zapata, but Emir Chiala. So how early on have Muslims been present in Latin America within these Latin contexts, etc.? Right? Next slide, please. We're almost done, guys. We're coming closer and closer to home, inshallah. Latino Muslims in the United States. Another very rich history, and this is, now it's very close to home. So please sorry, I'm kind of rambling here. Please pay close attention. Jazakallah khair, right? I don't believe, I'm not local, okay? I came from Toronto. I don't know the situation. I don't believe there seems to be very much sort of integration of this particular group of Muslims who can be referred to as Hispanic or Latino Muslims and the broader Muslim community. It seems like they're a bit isolated, right? That could be in part self-isolation, and that could be sort of isolation because the level of inclusion that we should have, that we should be kind of promoting and establishing within our masajid and in our spaces is not there. Allahu a'lam, I might be completely wrong. So please correct me if I am. That seems to be that's my perception. That seems to be what I have noticed. But there's a long history of Latino Muslims, Hispanic Muslims in this country. So keep that in mind. So I'm just going to give you a few examples, inshallah. The first one is this woman named Julia Villa, who married a Punjabi Muslim man, and we're talking about the 1920s. This is 100 years ago, right? So what would happen was, from the East Indies, as these laborers start to come, especially Punjabis, Gujaratis are coming to the West Coast of the United States, to California, to perform a lot of the labor that's needed. But because of very restrictive immigration policies, they're not allowed to bring their families with them, and they're often young men. They don't have families in that sense, right? So they marry among the groups that will sort of accept them. There's some kind of familiarity, there's some kind of relatability, and one of those groups are the Hispanic people, right? So intermarriage is what's causing these mixed families to develop between, and you'll see several examples down there, right? So if you see the second last point there, in particular, we have examples of Bengali, Punjabi, Yemeni, and Palestinian men marrying Latino women and beginning these mixed families around the 1950s, right? And particularly here in New York, in Chicago, and on the West Coast. Some cases in Florida and other places as well, but for the most part here, right? So in this case, you have Julia Villa. She marries a Punjabi Muslim man, and she becomes, as the quote says from the historian, an enthusiastic and zealous speaker for Islam, and started a short-lived Arabic class in El Centro, California. Right? This is in the 1920s that we're talking about, very early on, especially in California at the time. There is no Muslim community to speak of, and this Latino woman is beginning this Arabic class there, which means obviously that she must have spent some time and put some energy into learning it herself to some extent. I don't know if the Punjabi Muslim that she married taught her Arabic. I'm not sure. I can say that because I'm Punjabi myself. Okay, so I can make the jokes, right? Other interesting sort of cases, the flag of Mexico is flown at the Muslim Eid Day parade in 1921 in Michigan. So the Muslims, they have established sort of a musalla in Michigan at the time in 1921. They host an Eid Day parade, so you have the flags of Turkey being flown, basically from the different communities that are represented in that Michigan community. So obviously you're going to have a lot of Turkey, you're going to have a lot of Syria, right? You're going to have a lot of these Arab background sort of Muslims there. Why is the Mexican flag being flown in this mix, right? So we don't know if there's Latino Muslims present, right, or Hispanic, Mexican Muslims present in those communities. It just seems to be a strong indication. Another early example is this person, Addison Gilmore Rhodes, in the 1930s in Cleveland, in Ohio. And his story is interesting because he came across an Indian person and basically said, that guy looks a lot like me. You know what I mean? Like brown skin, we both have that sort of similarity. And that began his very intensive sort of research into, okay, what is India like? What are the people there like, et cetera, et cetera. He's reading about all these things, and ultimately he becomes Muslim, it seems, right? Allah knows best in a lot of these cases. It seems he embraces Islam because the people who were observing him, right? Observing him because he was a peculiarity in the society. He was a little different. He dressed different. He spoke different. His mannerisms were a little different, right? So his dress habits, his religious demeanor was that of Muslims, is the point they're making. I already mentioned sort of the mixed families, so that is another important conduit, right? This individual, keep this name in mind, Benjamin Perez, was single-handedly giving da'wah in California in the 1950s to the Latinos and the indigenous Muslims there, right? There are so many people within these communities who converted to Islam at that time, and their name will always go back and be connected with this one individual, Benjamin Perez, who had embraced Islam himself, of course, right? And then he continues to give da'wah to others, right? So these were people who were doing the heavy lifting even before most of the immigrant communities to which many of us belong to came here. So especially in that case, in a general sense as well, but especially in that kind of situation, when we don't give them their due recognition as a community within our community, that's a really bad thing. I mean, for lack of a better way of describing it, that's just not the situation as it's supposed to be, right? And then coming even closer to New York, right, you have, and this is history I hope at least some of the people here are somewhat familiar with, right? If not, then we have to do some work. We have to do some homework. We have to do some more reading. A lot of research is done. If you Google these things, they're not hard to find, right? In 1973, you have these three individuals, right, who embraced Islam in New York City, in Harlem, actually. And some of them went on to become part of ICNA and other sort of organizations. But they've been active in the Muslim community. I'm actually not sure who among them is still alive and who has passed on, right? May Allah have mercy on any of those who have passed on and bless those who are still with us. So that's in 1973, still very, very early on, right? And we're not even talking about the engagement with the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple and all of these other sort of proto-Muslim organizations that were operating around here, right? We're actually talking about conversion to Sunni, Orthodox Sunni Islam in this situation. In 1975, you have this organization being formed, right? The Alianza Islamica. Have we even heard about this? Right? Have people even heard about this organization? It still exists. They ran a magazine for several years, right? Giving da'wah within their communities, right? The magazine even went online until recently, at least it was there, and I think it got shut down, right? And in 1975, when they started out, in a few years, there were about 30 Latino families that were part of this organization within New York City, right? And in 1985, we have to give credit, Dr. T.B. Irving. Some of you may have heard this name because he's known for a lot of his research, for translating the Quran as well. He did a translation of the Quran. He was actually Canadian, moved around quite a bit. But this entire legacy that we've talked about, he was one of the first people to really go into the history of Muslims in Spain, in Al-Andalus, right? Dr. T.B. Irving was really one of the first academics in the West in the English language to really go into this history that now is so accessible for us. There's so many different ways to learn it. You can learn it at this event. You can go to Spain and learn it. You can find YouTube videos and all kinds of things about the history of Muslims in Spain. So he was one of the first. So we have to appreciate him for enabling the conversation we're having right now. And in 1985, they had an event much like this one in Harlem, right, where they discussed Muslim Spain and its legacy in the Americas, not too far from here. And these are just a few points. There's probably so many other things, right, to keep in mind. There are hundreds of thousands of Latino Muslims in the United States, Hispanic Muslims, right? Not a few thousand, there are more than 100,000. There are many of them. You know, you have seen these groups probably, Islam in Spanish, right? They're doing amazing work to try to bring the da'wah to more of these people. Why? Why especially these people? Because somewhere in their cultural memory is Al-Andalus, right? Somewhere in their cultural memory is Al-Andalus. The same way it is for African Americans. Many of them were brought from West Africa. Many of them were Muslim, right? Many of them were from Muslim sort of cultural context, and they went through the very disruptive process of the transatlantic slave trade. And they ended up in the situation where they are through the process, movements that spoke the language of Islam, even though they weren't Orthodox Muslims, such as the Nation of Islam and others, they reintroduced the language of Islam among African Americans. Some cultural elements of Islam among African Americans that paved the way for Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and Imam Wahiduddin Muhammad and all of these other incredible individuals that we have in the Sunni Muslim community now, and all the contributions that they made. We have to pay respect. We have to give credit where credit is due, even if we disagree with them theologically or from a legal standpoint, right? And the same thing here. So I'll leave you with that, right? Now I've given you a certain background. Hopefully I've shared some food for thought, and hopefully more than anything else, I've inspired you to go looking yourself, right? Go look who is sort of representing the Latino Muslim community in my community here in Long Island, in Brooklyn, right, in Queens. I'm sorry if I miss any because I'm still memorizing. In the Bronx, right, in Manhattan. I think I got all of them, the boroughs, right? It's a very complicated place, New York City, right? So I really appreciate all the people who are able to sort of give me a ride without without someone who knows the directions. You know what I mean? So it's important for us now as individuals, even within my masjid, even within my MSA, even within my workplace, right? In the city, you interact with people, right? You stand in line at a coffee shop, you're in the subway, etc. Don't shove it down someone's throat, but if someone seems open to conversation, if someone is clearly of a particular background, it's like, hey, do you know about Al-Andalus, right? Don't start off the conversation with Muslims invented algebra, right? Don't start off the conversation with, you have to believe this is halal, this is haram. Come to people from the point of information that's going to resonate with them the most. Talk to them about this history. It's like, we have a shared history. We are Muslims. Spain was special to us. You are Latino. Spain is obviously special to you. Let's have a conversation based on that, right? So I'm going to leave you with that. Hopefully it's beneficial. Jazakallah khair for listening. I really appreciate it. Are these questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Questions are coming in, so start at the top. So these are the last questions that came in.
So we have 1, 2 questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's do them, and we can go through these.
Okay, so the first question we have here is, what was the most practiced madhab in Al-Andalus? I actually don't know the answer to that, so I apologize. Probably, right? I would take a guess as well based on the North Africa connection, but well, that's something that is probably best to look up and confirm, and you'll easily find the answer, so I don't know off the top of my head. Regarding Anthony the Turk, what was the reason that Islam wasn't passed on to his future generations? We don't have very much information about him. We don't know if he tried or he did not try, right? And I guess the lesson we take from that situation is we should always pray for future generations, right? Think about, of course, everyone thinks about their children, everyone thinks about their grandchildren. A lot of effort when we build these beautiful masajid, when we do these programs, when we do everything, so much of it is for what? We are hoping that our children will be inspired Muslims. They will be confident Muslims, that they will carry on the faith for generations and generations to come, but it's never promised, right? It's never promised. Some very, very righteous people, their descendants are not Muslim. So we should always pray for those generations. So in the case of Anthony the Turk, we don't know. The Quran was passed down, right, from family to family, but the importance of the Quran was lost to them. For them, it was just a heritage of their ancestor. Okay, another question came in. Was Anthony the Turk married to a Muslim? How would I know? No, I'm kidding. Am I supposed to know this? So was Anthony the Turk married to a Muslim? Were there many other Muslims in New Netherlands at the time? Probably unlikely. So that's true. The only other person of Muslim background, we don't even know very specifically, was his brother. So his brother Ibrahim was also here in New Amsterdam at some point. So he seems to have been Muslim. They were the Muslim family. It's not even, it doesn't seem that even his children retained Islam when they grew up as adults, right? So about his wife, we don't know for sure if she was Muslim or Christian or what she was. We don't have that information. All right. So these are the questions as well. I didn't answer all of them. Anyone in the just want to ask a question? Just if you have any, please feel free to scream it out.
Anyone in the back, please text if you can. The number is 60, right up here.
Okay, so the question we have here is, do you have any plans on converting your findings into a book or some digital format? Inshallah, at some point. I don't have a plan yet. I won't say I have a plan, but I have this dream, right, of actually writing these things down and putting it into writing. But I will say one thing, you know, Googling has a very bad reputation. If I just say, hey guys, just Google something. And that's why, the reason for that is we don't really do it the right way. You have to Google something specific, right? If you search Muslims in Brooklyn, you're going to get a certain number of results, because Google is not a historian. It's not a historian on the other side who's trying to figure out, okay, what does this person want information about? Let me display those results on the first page. It's just an algorithm, right? It's not that sort of intuitive. So it's not like you're talking to a librarian or something like that. What you have to do is get more specific with your searches, and you would be surprised by what you find. Now, first of all, obviously don't trust everything you find, but my research, everything that I've learned, everything that was on those slides all began with a Wikipedia page. No shame in saying that, right? Wikipedia is this incredible resource for the first time in human history that knowledge has been compiled at that level. Start there. 90% of the information will always, if it's not precise, if it's not accurate, it will generally be correct, enough for the average person. It might get me fired as a historian if I don't verify it properly, right? But for the average person, most of that information will be correct. So I think sometimes we give ourselves a lot of excuse in that way, that I just don't have access to the right resources. So keep that in mind as well. Do your own Googling, and do your own legwork, basically, within your own communities. Talk to people, right? This particular conversation is about Latino Muslims, right? And that legacy, but just talk to people. Do we know each other? Do we really spend any time at all? Sometimes for years, you go for Jummah after Jummah, you see the same people at the masjid every night of Taraweeh, right? You go every single night to the masjid, mashallah, right? But at the end of it, you don't know anything more about the person who prayed Taraweeh right next to you than you did on day one. And sometimes the only things you know are the bad things, right? Oh, I find this thing really annoying about that guy. I don't know his name. I don't know where he lives or anything like that, but that guy is, may Allah accept his Taraweeh because he made mine pretty difficult, kind of thing, right? You know what I mean? So do the legwork, right? Actually speak to people. You'll learn a lot just by observing, just by speaking, just by being in the right spaces. Google, and then inshallah, I can do my part to prepare some more resources that will help over time to give you something to read as well, inshallah. Another question is, we live in a place in the US where history is well preserved, and I can only imagine how much related to Muslim participation is hidden in our museums and libraries. Absolutely. We would have to go to the museums and libraries to find out, but there is a lot, right? The museums and libraries will not come to us at home and display it on our dinner table. We have to go into those spaces, right? Take some time, even as a masjid or an Islamic school, organize, like take a trip to the Brooklyn Museum, be like, this is the very document. This is the original copy of the document, right? This is like 400 years old. This was the first Muslim who lived in New York City. This is our heritage. The document is right here. This is the first person, non-indigenous person, who lived on Coney Island. He had all of this land, right? So we can facilitate that for our communities, inshallah. Just take that effort. You guys have a lot of incredible museums in New York City. I'm kind of jealous as a person from Toronto, right? When I go to New York and I see the Smithsonian's and all of that, I go to Washington D.C., right? And I see all of those museums over there. I'm like, these guys have a lot, right? There's a lot to learn that would be both enriching for us as Muslims in terms of reflecting on the different cultures, right? And enriching specifically in the sense of da'wah. You have to learn about someone before you can learn how to speak to them. You have to know who you're speaking to, who you're communicating the message of Islam to. So take advantage of all the museums and all of these, facilities that you have here. Okay, there's a few other questions. I'm just going to switch to those. What can we do as a center, local community to better educate our children on the history of Islam in America? Confidence in today's identity is so important. In one's identity is so important in today's time. Absolutely, the last point is absolutely correct. What can we do as a center? Not to be sort of make it about me, but right, have more sessions of this kind. Right, these are the spaces. We have a lot of sessions about deen, which are extremely important, which are more important than the history, studying the actual ahkam of the deen and all of these things, etc. But at the same time, history is an important discipline. History does help us understand a lot of things. It does enable us to do a lot of things, right? And so that's certainly important. Start with your masjid. And if you're not a member of the masjid organizers, if you're a community member, encourage your masjid. This is what we want to see. Write them an email. Don't just assume they won't do it. Don't just assume the masjid isn't interested in these kind of events. If you're a member of the community, reach out to the masjid and be like, this is what we want. When the masjid sees a real interest in a topic from their community, I'm sure they will do something to facilitate that if it seems like it's good for the community, right? Don't just assume the masjid doesn't do it, so I'm not even going to ask. No, push for it a little bit. At least try. Right? So I think these conversations, I could say, like I just said, go to the museums, etc., etc. But when it comes to the history of Muslims, a lot more conversation has to happen within our own spaces, MSAs as well, but even more importantly, within our masajid. Yeah, just the question. So I think there's two more here. I'm just going to quickly, inshallah. Yeah, sorry. I missed the question that was asked to praying for future generations. Yeah, so what I said basically was we should pray for Islam to endure in our future generations of our families, right? So that's the point. And also, we should pray for our communities in the same way that we pray for our families, right? Because like we said, the example of Andalus is a very, very powerful one, right? Don't get too confident in New York City because you have these amazing masajid and you have something like 1 million Muslims who live here, mashallah. All of these things are incredible, but we can never get too comfortable. There is always work to do, and the work is always growing, and we should ask Allah to increase us in capacity, and we should ask Allah to use us, do not replace us. Use us, make us the conduit, right? Make us the means by which you establish your will for the good of the community. Right? Because Muslims ruled Spain in a very, very powerful way, in a way that they would think that nothing is ever going to change. This will always be a Muslim land. No one can take this away from us. That's how deeply entrenched it was. But history tells a different story, as we know, and it can happen anywhere. Last question here, because it's almost Adhan time, and it is the last question. Did Tariq ibn Ziyad really burn down his boat? So I did address this, but I'll just repeat it. Something else just came in about Coney Island. So we can, if you have more questions, inshallah, you can come up to me afterwards. I'll just be around for a little bit. You can ask me directly. Tariq ibn Ziyad, as far as we know, those ships that they sailed the Strait of Gibraltar across on, those ships were not his personal property. he could not make random decisions. We're going to burn the ships, etc., right? Those were the property of the collective, of the Muslims. So that's why it's very unlikely, and it's also a very impractical decision. I mean, yes, we use it to say he was so brave, he was so confident, he was inspiring his people to say, we're going to burn the boats. We're either going to fight to the death, right? Or we're going to conquer. But it seems very unlikely that he would need to do that and actually burn down all his ships and things like that. As far as I'm concerned, based on everything I've read relevant to that, I don't think that's a very accurate story. So we'll end off there. Jazakallah khair. It's Azan time. And I really appreciate the organizers. I'm very grateful to them for giving me this opportunity. Inshallah, we can reconvene as a community in the future as well. Please keep me in your du'as, and you are all certainly in mine. Jazakallah khair.